Hello and welcome to today's RIMS webinar, Bermuda and the Changing Landscape of Climate Risk, sponsored by the Bermuda Business Development Agency. My name is Justin Smollison, Business Content Manager here at RIMS, the Risk and Insurance Management Society. A few notes before we begin. If you have a question for the presenters during today's session, please submit them by writing in the question box. Ask at any point during the presentation. We will reserve time at the end for Q&A. Following this session, the recording will be available on rims.org. All downloads and contact information will be accessible to the sponsor. And on to today's session. The session will be moderated by Stephen Weinstein, the chairman of the Bermuda Business Development Agency. Stephen was elected BDA chair in 2020 and has been a member of the board since 2016. He currently serves as an advisor to Renaissance Re, having retired after 2 decades from his role as executive vice president, group general counsel, corporate secretary, and chief compliance officer. During his time with Renaissance Re, Stephen was chair of the Risk Sciences Foundation, the company's charitable vehicle committed to researching and developing risk mitigation techniques and raising awareness through conferences and outreach events, including the award-winning Risk Mitigation Leadership Forum Series, and served as a member of the executive committee. RIMS is thrilled to welcome a huge global audience, and now I will hand it over to Bermuda Business Development Agency Chairman Stephen Weinstein.
Thank you very much, Justin. Hello, everyone. Thank you again for attending the broader RIMS event, and in particular for attending this panel on climate risk and climate risk management, a topic about which these expert panelists you're about to meet are both passionate and sincere and devoted to. We're glad you're here with us today and looking forward to the conversation. You know, it wasn't so long ago that debates around climate change at times seemed to focus on the veracity of climate risk. Today, the debate has evolved into a discussion of how severe it is, how bad it's going to get, and whether our efforts to transition and adapt can be successful. We're confident that we can, because we are based in Bermuda, where a solutions-based history and culture have been prominent, both for the country of Bermuda and for the business strategies of the firms we've all been associated. While we didn't plan it when scheduling this event, recent events in the news have only reinforced this topic as an important theme. Whether it's the record-breaking heat waves of the United States, an early breaking storm season, or the other events which are making the news, and the fairly dire forecast for the rest of the year. At the same time, our most significant risk represents our most significant set of business and investment opportunities. And that balance of risk assessment and forward-leaning pursuit of new opportunities is the theme that will unite the panelists that are here with you today. It is a big topic and our time is short. Let's get right to it. I'd like to start by letting our panelists each introduce themselves quickly and mention one area of focus or passion that is on their radar screen before we get to the broader discussion. Andrew, why don't I invite you to kick us off?
Thanks, Steve. Andrew Engler, I'm co-founder and CEO of Kettle. Background is insurance and technology, worked for Allstate for a number of years, helped build the second largest agency in California and ran the commercial book of business for the state of Arizona and helped them build their online quoting platform. And then got to spend a number of years working at Argo Group as head of digital and machine learning, and now focused really in climate change, specifically as a California native in wildfire and how we can utilize groundbreaking technology to better understand these emerging risks.
Fantastic, Andrew, thanks. Hello, Jeff, good to see you. Let me turn the mic over to you.
Hi, Steve, thanks very much, appreciate it. Hello, everyone. And I'm Jeff Manson from Renaissance Re. I've been with Renaissance for over 14 years now, and the bulk of my time has been as a property underwriter, focusing on North American and worldwide risks. And more recently, I'm responsible for heading up our public sector partnership group at Ren. So it's exciting place to be, and a lot of new work going on there. So we can chat about that later. But thanks, Steve.
Thanks, Jeff. Hello, Ariane.
Hi, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here with this group. So my name's Ariana West. I would say I have a long background in structured products, initially as a lawyer, and then moving on to the structuring side with an investment bank in the US, and then in more recent years in the Bermuda market, focusing on insurance-linked risks and climate risks. And I would say I've been spending a lot of time recently focusing on the increasing need for integration of climate risk considerations into overall strategy and planning, and then for organizations across the board, and then really looking at how to design and implement products that help to do that, to manage these new types of risks.
Fantastic. Thanks for joining us. Let's jump right into the broader discussion. Andrew, as your summary mentioned, you've been involved in your career in digital innovations, new frontiers in tech, and marrying those innovations with risk transfer. And you seem currently very focused on Wildfire, as you mentioned. Why don't we start with Wildfire as a case study? It's ripped from the headlines, unfortunately. What opportunities do you see to bridge the wildfire protection gap and better protect the RIMS community from climate risks? Where do you see challenges and opportunities?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Steve. And Wildfire is this kind of perfect example. So if we read any modern headline, and I think there was like 10 yesterday that all said the lakes are dry, everything is going to burn, we're all screwed, basically. And look, I'm not making light of the situation. There's an undeniable increase in the frequency and severity of these events, which is due to climate factors, also anthropogenic, and the spread of wildfire interface and people living closer. The issue is when we start to overbias data and get past actually viewing what the underlying data is. And the perfect example is 2020 was the third worst year in modern history for wildfires. You had about 4% of the state burn, about 4.5 million acres, and we lost 11,466 structures, which I'm not making light of that many people losing their home or their livelihoods. But out of 14 million structures, that is a wildly small minority. So when we start to see a lot of the representation of the state or the risk modeling coming out, and you'll notice like sometimes 70% of the state is being looked at as uninsurable, that's fundamentally incorrect when you look at just the back of the envelope math in terms of the data. And so I think it's important because reinsurance at its core, we're essentially the one industry that's standing there against the black swan event. And so when we start to see events like this, yes, increase in frequency and severity in terms of like the danger of it, but very manageable, especially now combined with the massive amount of technology data that we have and the explosion of that and the available compute power that we see, where we currently run 3,414 separate virtual machines for what would be probably 1/1000th of the cost of at least 10 years ago. And we're able to pull in 7 billion lines of geospatial data, vast majority of it free. It's been up in space since the late 90s. It's all NASA. We suddenly have this emergence between multiple areas where I think it's important for the industry as a whole, where we recognize, one, it is kind of the primary duty of the reinsurance industry to be the biggest safety net against climate change or catastrophic events. But there is a very manageable quantitative angle that we can start to approach these risks from and really start to understand them, which I think is important in terms of, otherwise you're kind of left with the fact of, well, who else is going to do that? And I see very incredible alignment with reinsurers. So as we look at like the startup space, if I'm a startup who wants to, gather the best data scientists from hedge funds and NASA and SpaceX, and I'm going to now build a product where I'm going to use satellite imagery and deep learning to predict where wildfires are going to start. If my business model is to sell that to fire departments and legislators, there is no way I'm going to be able to convince a fire department to spend $20,000 a month on that model. There's just simply not enough budget there. But in reinsurance, you have this financial alignment that's incredibly wonderful. It's not a zero-sum game where everyone actually does better if we can, one, figure out how to better understand these risks, two, start to give away some of this information for free or align with other parties, whether it be fire departments to help them create better fire line breaks, with utilities to help them do a far more quantitative shutdown strategy. And now all of a sudden we have control over decreasing this frequency and severity, which makes it more manageable and obviously allows that kind of capacity to scale at a bigger sense. And in the end, it's really in alignment with all parties in that chain.
Andrew, I want to take my gavel and take the liberty of asking you a question as well, because you touched upon some themes that as you know, I'm passionate about. That when we encounter a peril that's either changed or is new or both, there can be at times an instinct to say, well, I don't have data, I don't know it, I didn't write it last year. I can't do it. Let me invite you to comment more on that and to give us even more color, if you can, on some of the techniques that you see applying to bridge those challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know we've waxed poetic on this, or at least you've been kind enough to listen to me drone on about way too technical topics, Steve. But you know what's phenomenally interesting is where we see breakthroughs in deep learning and much more complex areas of machine learning in other scientific fields. One such being complexity theory and chaos theory. So you have the Santa Fe Institute that's been around since pretty much the creation of the atom bomb and really focused in chaos theory, where you have massive movements forward in understanding incredibly complex topics like how ions and positive other charges and other world sort of physics that we look at in kind of the quantum sphere, and how, yes, the underlying mechanics of it are so wildly complex that there's no way we can understand it. But in what they kind of call emergence technology, you can start to find very high level patterns that align. So while we may not be able to say we can, you know, positively track a single atom and then track 100 of them and describe, you know, the future of the Earth, a great metaphor for it is, you know, the Earth is made up of 10 to the 50th power amount of atoms. We don't need to understand every single atom inside of that Earth to understand where the Earth is moving. All we have to do is understand where the center of mass is and velocity, and we can chart out where the Earth is going to be for the next 1,000 years. And that's essentially the same kind of theory that we need to start approaching these emerging risks from. So if you can take this massive set of data and even more simplified things where we're saying, look, we're going to take a lighter or microwave beam that is giving us a better intuition of what soil moisture is in California alone, we'll say. And now we're going to use this 20-year history and we're going to correlate it to when we've seen a spike or an increase in events. So what did camp look like before camp exploded and created that kind of devastating catastrophe? And we can start to get our head around, okay, there is obviously positive correlation between these two events. Now, I can't say I'm going to be able to predict, I'm never going to be able to predict with 100% accuracy which areas are going to light on fire and which ones aren't. But the most important thing is backing up and saying, okay, we've now again said that 70% of the state is uninsurable. And yes, you know, the sky is going to turn orange again this year. It's not going to be a great year for wildfire. But the important fact is how many of these houses in California, if only 0.1% of them burn, how many of them have been swept into the same bucket of saying this is fundamentally uninsurable area, which is an unsustainable model, which we know going forward. So taking small sliver approaches of being able to say, here's an asymmetric data source we know is ground truth data. We can take and borrow or I guess steal from some of these much more complex quantitative modeling techniques in deep learning or particle swarm optimization that are used in these same ways that we may not understand every single small underlying mechanic, but we can get a positive understanding of what the stochastic band is in the future. What are the likely scenarios? And we can start to wrap our heads around taking chunks off of what is currently, in the market sense, where we just look at it and we say, okay, what more can we exclude? Instead of saying, okay, let's understand what parts we can take. And also there's always a positive movement towards it where you see the price dislocation happens at these points where, like you're saying, the complexity increases, which is a very positive area to actually implement any sort of machine learning or data-driven approach, because as with any machine learning model or data science-specific approach, your loss error function, the most error you have is at the beginning and it decreases over time. And so you kind of need that price dislocation to buffer in for your inaccuracy. So it actually lends itself incredibly well to anywhere we see this, whether it be convective storm or other areas that are similar.
That's all really exciting, Andrew. I wonder if Jeff, Ariane, any questions or reactions to that wildfire rapid case study?
No, I think, looking at it as an opportunity and using data and analytics to, challenge historic biases is the right approach. We see time and time again from multiple events where, outcomes have surprised pre-existing sort of norms. there's a hindsight bias, a recency bias, where people have a tendency to just say, we don't understand it, this is uninsurable, let's just not go there, which kind of is a good segue into some of the stuff that I'll talk about shortly. But yeah, I think that the wildfire example is a perfect one, and what Andrew and team are doing is really exciting work. So keep it up.
And just a quick interjection into that one, Jeff, too. It's important. We have to have that expertise that is inherent in the reinsurance industry. One common thing that we've noticed when we've been writing policies, there's like a common clause called a 2-risk warranty, which is actually a critical function of most reinsurance policies. And it's made so you don't end up having a guy with a barbecue fire that lights his house on fire and you go, it's a wildfire. But now that we're kind of trying to try new products and write new things, you have to change the underlying actual structure and fundamentals of a policy by saying, all right, are we going to use a PCS definition? Is there a way that we can look at satellite images and say, all right, any fire that's above 1,000 acres now triggers? And so there's this incredible, interesting balance that has to be had between the traditional sources of capital, which will always be there and prevail, and the structures that have worked for an incredibly long time, and then figuring out, all right, how do you adjust them to meet the right problems that they've traditionally solved?
Yeah. And I would say, based on, my experience working on developing products and partnering with that side of things, the modeling and the data and the technology development, I think what's really powerful and what Andrew was describing is, all the amazing things that can be done, all the fantastic insights and data that's there, coupled with an awareness of the limitations of what's not there, so that when you're designing a product, you're really kind of pulling from the possible without being blind to the limitations of what the data can tell you in terms of how that would perform and how that translates to an actual product.
Yeah.
Agreed. Jeff, you commented that we have somehow teed up a perfect segue to what I know are some of your remarks. Particularly that theme of insuring the allegedly uninsurable, particularly a climate-related risk. In many respects, the modern Bermuda market, which is built upon even earlier excellence in the RIMS universe, captive management, really was launched with Hurricane Andrew, when so many parties decided, and there was a paradigm shift with Andrew, particularly in respect of the severity of tropical cyclones. But the premise that it was uninsurable was not one that the Bermuda market welcomed, and a wave of innovation and capital allocation sprung forth. And then a similar pattern took place with flood. So Jeff, you yourself have had a lot to do with that, and of course your shop has. Share with us your thoughts on some of that history and where climate risk is taking you.
Certainly, thanks, Steve. And I can wear two hats here and talk a little bit about experiences from a Renaissance Re-centric perspective, but also more broadly from a Bermuda reinsurance industry perspective. And wanted to kind of touch on some of those examples, but also focus on the emergent risk of climate change, which has been around for a while, but clearly is now top of mind for most, I would think. So we can start off just Andrew. It's a great example, as in Hurricane Andrew, not Andrew Engler. But it was at the time. I think the industry assumption was that 10 billion was the biggest event one could expect in Florida. Well, Andrew came around, and boom, that was 25+ billion in 1993 dollars, right? So you think about what that meant. It was completely unprecedented, and people didn't understand it, couldn't understand it. And there were a group of reinsurance startup companies that saw that as an opportunity. And what did they do? They actually leveraged technology, right? And they started to think about natural perils and events more so from a probabilistic basis, and leveraging newly emerging vendor modeling technology to really think about these risks on a broader basis. Before that time, it was a much more sort of old school underwriting approach. How much exposure did you have in a certain area, and how much exposure could you expect to lose in a given event? That's still a relevant sort of data point when thinking about building out risk distributions, but it was primitive relative to technology that was being developed. Now, that was 25 years ago. Technology's come a long way since then, And we have been seeing waves of startup innovators trying to bring more sophisticated solutions to the insurance and risk transfer problem. And I think what Andrew Engler is doing with his team is a perfect example of that. So I think and Hurricane Andrew was a good example. And then you can roll forward to 2004, 2005. A very similar thing happened, right? People were using models, and people thought that, the industry, I should say, thought that they had a pretty clear grasp of what exactly, the risk was in Florida. Well, after 04 and 05, an unprecedented frequency of events, experienced, seasoned industry underwriters kind of shook their heads, scratched their heads and said, we can't insure this. We don't understand it anymore. We can't do it. That was one group. There was another group that actually stopped, looked, said, well, actually, does this fit in our existing distributions or probabilistic distributions? And the answer was, well, yes. Now, was it slightly outside of what we would have expected? Yes, but it was certainly, it was an expected outcome. And so rather than running away from it, what Renaissance Re and many others in the industry did was to, evolve views of risk and say, actually, no, we can still do this, and we want to be here for, on a long-term basis and be sustainable risk transfer capital for our clients. But there is a new view of risk, and there's a cost associated with that increased risk profile. And so that was a great example again of where some saw an event as oh, that's it, game over, and others saw a challenge as an opportunity. And so and I think Bermuda has shown time and time again that it looks at challenges as opportunities and has done an incredible job doing that. And I think we can look at other examples like flood, and we can talk about that a little later. But I wanted to kind of pause there and just sort of back up a bit and talk a little bit more about climate change, which is not only a new thing. Well, it's not really new, but it's a now thing. And if there are three things that folks could take away from this chat, I think number one is it is a now challenge, right? I mean, the risk of climate change has been there for decades now, and it has been increasing, as we know, with carbon concentrations in the atmosphere, and we need to act now. So the second thing to remember is we need to be proactive. Yes, there is uncertainty. There's more uncertainty than there has been in a long time, but you know what? We need to act. And the third thing is that we can act. And why? Because we have the tools and experience to do it. And I think that's what's exciting about this whole challenge, is that we do have an incredible track record, not just in Bermuda, but in the reinsurance industry in general, as far as meeting challenges. But Bermuda is definitely kind of top of the game when it comes to understanding climate risk. So when we think about climate risks, we at Renaissance Re specifically, it's a very complex issue. We've broken it into, call it, 4 buckets, where we basically think, okay, where are we seeing very clear evidence of a new normal? And we can see that in perils in regions like wildfire in California, wildfire in Australia. We see it in areas like hurricane storm surge and precipitation. And so that would be in the very clear evidence bucket. And then we have another bucket, which is, well, we're expecting change. We're seeing what we think is change, but it's still a little difficult to parse out what we think is, evidence versus just noise in the system, or, natural climatic variability, like long-term multi-decadal drought, or other type of multi-decadal naturally occurring phenomenon. And then there's a third bucket where it's like, okay, well, we're expecting things to happen, but we're not really seeing evidence. And then there's a fourth bucket where, well, we don't really, expect much change, or we're not anticipating any change yet, but maybe there will be. But that's how we've tried to break out a very complex climate change issue into something that's more digestible. And I think, focusing on the flood aspect, right? That's something that we know is happening today, and we're seeing that. when you look at recent tropical cyclone and hurricane events, we're seeing greater flooding as a result of those events because the sea level is higher than it was 100 years ago. We know that. That's empirical data that shows us that. And so, we can work at that. We can understand that risk. Interestingly, a few years back, the National Flood Insurance Program in the United States, that was flood risk in North America was always considered an uninsurable peril. And so it was a state fund that insured that risk. In Europe, flood has been considered an insurable peril for decades. Now, a few years ago, the NFIP actually embraced risk transfer with the private reinsurance industry and to look at offsetting, the public sector, i.e. taxpayer liability, into the private sector. So that was a great example of public-private partnership, private insurance industry working collaboratively together with, a federal agency to help them better understand their risk and find ways where they can offset that taxpayer liability to the private market. So, that's an example. Hopefully that's certainly not the last. I mean, there are numerous other examples where that has taken place with California wildfire risk, with the California Wildfire Fund. And, we can look at other examples with Florida, the Florida Hurricane Catastrophe Fund, all examples where the reinsurance market has stepped in and helped to transfer that risk. But, going back to the three things that we wanted to focus on, it's a now thing, right? I mean, that's obviously very important. We can face this challenge by being proactive. And then finally, we have the tools. And, just as far as, the experience, Bermuda has paid out over 200 billion of losses over the last 20 years to primary insureds around the world. And that includes 30% of the insured liabilities from the HIM losses in 2017 and the 2004 and 2005 KRW losses. So I don't want to, monopolize all the time on this call, but there is a lot to talk about. I think Bermuda, has clearly demonstrated, successful history of seeing challenges as opportunities, leveraging technology, and just being innovators, right? I mean, I think the class of '93 were actually, technology disruptors way back in the day, and I think we're continuing to see that type of activity, focusing in and around Bermuda. And climate change is unprecedented. There's no question about it, right? I wouldn't want that to be missed, but there are elements of climate change that we have seen before, right? And right now, I think a lot of people are looking at climate change as it's a problem that's too big. How do we do it? And it's like, well, it is a big problem, and you know what? We're going to need to take unprecedented steps to look to address it. We can't cure it. We can't stop it. It's happening, right? This has been kind of developing for decades. But what we can do is we can look to mitigate it as best we can through various techniques. We can look at land use planning. We can use classic forms of risk transfer, right, through insurance and reinsurance. And it's going to take everything. It's not going to be, there's not one silver bullet that's going to solve this. But I'm excited that, working together collaboratively, public and private sector, working more closely than they've ever worked before, we have a chance of, making the future a long-term, sustainable, livable place for everybody. So with that, I'll perhaps take a pause and take a breath and see if there are any other areas you want me to focus on.
Jeff, fantastic presentation and fantastic summary. Both the expertise that you and Andrew have summarized and represent and are in as well, when you combine that with the unprecedented dire fiscal situation of every developed country government coming out of COVID, it's hard to imagine a more interesting set of opportunities for the experience and capacities that your shops all have, and partnering with risk aggregators to bridge that gap, whether traditional insured risk or new climate-driven risks. And I'll date myself. I'm old enough to remember when a correct answer on the US CPCU exam to the question, is flood insurable, was no. Despite, as you said, a big product in Europe and actually a vibrant market for commercial flood in the US. But that had said, if it's somehow uninsurable, was how you passed that exam in the early stages of my career. But Jeff, let me combine some of your observations with a question we have in the chat from the audience. You mentioned climate change is now, and you use the phrase it's unprecedented. And the question we have in the Q&A is, how do you, as stewards of capital in the private sector, manage black swan risk against those challenges? And I'd invite any of you who cares to respond to that to respond.
I'm happy to give it a shot. Andrew, do you want to go first? I know you've obviously thought a lot about this with your approach to wildfire.
Are you saying I look like a very worried person all the time? Well, and in terms of like the black swan, and first thing I want to say is Bermuda is so critical in this, and it's because of the speed of innovation that this small island, and it punches so high above its weight. If we're talking about climate change, it's this wild subject that we go, okay, it's kind of undeniable. We see more hurricanes, we see more wildfires, and yet somehow it's politicized. And so it becomes this hugely complex and actually very emotionally biased issue, when in fact, hurricanes don't really care where you're from, who you are. They're going to hit the area, destroy the homes, and destroy people's lives. And so it comes from a data-based area that we need to start making these approaches and decisions. And when we look at it, speaking of like black swan events, the black swan event is what we know or what we don't know is going to happen. So when I look at California, I don't see like, wildfire, this is gonna be bad. Wildfire is manageable. We have data on it. We have an understanding of how it's grown over time. What scares me completely is the worst catastrophic event in California was the 1861 flood, which basically destroyed 1/3 of the state, made it bankrupt, and killed about 1% of the population. So it's important for us as reinsurers to really focus on true black swans. But even more important is, like you're saying, what is here now? What is the data-based approach that we can bring back to the world and say, this is a fundamentals approach. You cannot argue with the facts that we are presenting here. And the place being saying that, look, this is actually an uninsurable rate. This is an unsustainable rate going forward. This is the mathematical reason that we kind of all agree here. And that takes data sharing. That takes obviously a lot of working together and kind of unifying under certain principles. But it's necessary, because then it doesn't become this cycle that might be unsustainable in the future, where you're looking at a very high volatility of, okay, a huge event happens, price is up, it's party time, and then it slowly goes further and further down, past a point that no one can see until that event hits, which is fine if that period in between is very long. And so, everyone can survive it. The problem is, all right, you increase that frequency and severity, and now it becomes really important to understand what is that threshold layer that is really a danger point that will start to put us in sort of critical positions. And so that's where I think the black swans can really keep you up. You can be staring at the sun, wondering when it's going to throw another mass coronal ejection at us, or we can say, all right, those will happen. We will have a plan for them, but right now there is plenty to tackle directly in front of us.
Andrew, thanks for tackling that one. You mentioned 19th century loss events. So we have data about events beyond the recent time, and trends have changed. But our protection, our physical protection against some of those events that we know occurred in the 19th century remains 19th century infrastructure. And I think the value of the tools that you all bring to the market is to show policymakers and others where investments in the physical world will have enormous financial returns. That's a big part of what you bring to the table. Which is a segue to me to Ariana. We talked about waxing poetic over ensuring that insurable, and you and I have waxed poetic, or at least you have on I know what one of your passions, integration. Whether it's an integrated approach to climate risk or more broadly for risk transfer, I know you have an observation that frequently it's siloed and not fully integrated into how firms, governments, even households make decisions. So with that as a segue, let me invite you to, how can we change that? How do we get better at that, and how do we move forward from here?
Sure. And so just, I guess, trying to take a step back and think about the approach to product design and solution design. In terms of the uninsurable, I was just thinking about the fact that, we do tend to have a certain concept of risk transfer, where one party will take on the risk up to a limit and have it be a fairly clear-cut transaction. But I think, there are other ways of approaching risk management. And when we get into a point where you're looking at scenarios that perhaps are deemed to be uninsurable or not sustainable in terms of the rate, and certainly not on an annual renewal basis, you can start looking at different types of solutions, like volatility management, so risk financing, and particularly where you get into scenarios where it seems as though it's not a mean reverting risk, and perhaps like climate change, for example, it could be that year on year the risk is becoming more and more severe. So alternative structures like risk financing and volatility smoothing are a way to increase stability and enable organizations or governments to manage that risk, while other sustainability focused initiatives or perhaps changes in policy, those can be given a chance to take hold or be put in place. So that's kind of, I think, another alternative kind of mindset to come at it is, okay, well, we have these tools in our toolbox, but what are some other approaches that we can take? And one thing in terms of the integration of climate risk considerations, and particularly also looking at non-catastrophic climate risks into overall strategy and planning. Part of the new reality for many businesses and organizations facing increasing climate volatility. So these can be things like heat, cold, drought, in addition to these extreme events that we often talk about. These things can affect things like logistics, market demand, infrastructure. And so product development can often, good product development can often be a partnership between the risk transfer and risk management industry and the actual end users of the products. So I would say the first step that we often, focus on is to, one, understand your climate exposures as best you can. This is clearly something, this aspect of it, data can be key. Highly, technical approaches, as well as just, observation within organizations and attunement to these risks, and accepting and understanding that these are really going to be of strategic importance over time. So the second step is to then integrate that into your enterprise risk management and planning, and a key thing, and going forward, I think what we're seeing, in terms of climate volatility in general, is anticipating also the cascading effects, the ways in which, one impact might affect another. So that going back to things like logistics and market demand, something, I guess, you could kind of tie it to that like butterfly theory, like something happening, far, afield might actually impact your businesses in ways that, if you're not really thinking about it in a holistic way, might escape you in that type of planning and risk management process. So, and then the third step that I think we often go through is then to attempt to quantify those exposures. And I think this is where we can really expect to see a shift in approaches to risk management through investment in resilience or alternative risk transfer. And I think that's where the insurance industry and markets like Bermuda have a really big role to play in terms of partnering with governments and organizations in terms of helping them to develop that quantification of the risk exposures that, a lot more effort needs to be invested in actually tracking and monitoring.
And one challenge, I'm glad you ended on that. It's hard to manage what you find hard to measure. I wonder if I can draw you a bit now as we look to gather that data and quantify. What are we quantifying? If you could share more of your thoughts, and then if you have views on, and who might we report that to? Management, risk managers, capital providers. But if you could tackle any aspect of that, I'd be grateful.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think this is obviously definitely, an internal job for, every organization, whether it's public or private sector. And obviously the specifics are going to be particular to that organization in terms of, what type of business they are, what type of physical exposures you might have. Mind you, in a broader sense, there's also, digital exposures, things that are more ephemeral. So there's a pretty broad base, and it's going to be tailored to any individual organization. But I think one thing that we're definitely seeing a lot of, it's clear that there's a need for, is development of standards and guidance so that organizations can kind of have a working framework and understand. And there's two aspects to this. One is effective risk management within an organization, but then the other flip side of the coin, and where we're starting to see more and more standardization. I mean, a key thing, I think one of the kind of frameworks that's a little bit out front is, the Task Force for Climate Related Financial Disclosures. I think you've seen some pretty good traction there. And what that also enables is to help to support the development of some consistency around the questions different types of businesses should be asking, how to frame it, how to report on it. And that will also feed into the delivery of data to the market in terms of investment decisions and financing decisions, so that these risks, climate related risks, which can be obviously be very systemic in nature, certainly catastrophic events when they occur, they can have broad effects across industries and companies and entire regions. So really having effective and consistent disclosure that can be fed into financing decisions and investment decisions, that's kind of a key element to also helping to manage systemic risk. So I would say, there are jokes out there about, standards about standards, and that, it's a positive thing. I think that a lot of different discrete groups are paying attention to this. But I think what we are seeing is we're seeing, like things like the Bank of England and the PRA really picking up the TCFD and incorporating that into their requirements. I think, you might see something similar, from the SEC when they get through, their review process. I think people are maybe expecting it to look perhaps quite different from what we're seeing out of the UK and in Europe, but at least, we are seeing forward momentum there. Obviously in Europe, the SFDR, a lot of progress there, although also a lot of work, because whenever you undertake something ambitious like this, I think, and ambitious and complex, I think we're probably going to go through a period of a few years with a lot of ironing out of, what does this mean? How do I apply it? Is this really effective? So, we're in early days. I think to some parties it maybe feels a bit overwhelming, but I think it's just the natural process of trying to go through such a complex problem and come out on the other side where you actually have some kind of standardization of information, guidance, disclosures that are going to allow us to address these risks in the way they need to be, which is on a systemic basis.
Ariana, thank you for tackling a tough set of questions there. And for those who haven't, I would encourage you to familiarize yourself with the TCFD framework. In my prior gig, I counted to at least 40 requests for reporting. No one is perfect yet, but the TCFD, it's quite thoughtful, it's robust. And as Ariana mentioned, it's getting traction. So the reality of being required, whomever you are, to have to provide data reports to someone in that framework will only increase. And it's quite thoughtful in part by calling upon you and giving you a relatively consistent architecture to report on your strategy both to manage risk and to grow your business as applicable, as opposed to finding kind of made up numbers which may or may not have a lot of relevance to the business. But speaking of relevance to your business, another thing that really caught me in your earlier remarks, Ariana, is you were listing sectors of the economy that have climate risk: retail, logistics, transport. It's also a list of the RIMS universe, and where the RIMS family has firms and client access and relationships. How can we in our market collaborate even more with RIMS to bring solutions to market and further the partnership that's characterized our decades together?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I would say the Bermuda market in general, I think, has always embraced opportunities to, be out front and ask hard questions and, bring new solutions. So I think you saw that through, the history with insurance-linked securities, essentially bringing a channel for a new source of capital to be applied to reinsurance and insurance risk in a different way. I think we're poised to see a repeat of that capacity and capability of the Bermuda market to focus on the problem at hand, the now problem, as Jeff said, and really say, what can we do as a market? I do think, taking a page from the insurance-linked securities book, access to increased sources of capital, diverse sources of capital, I think is a key thing. I think the BMA's announcement that they are forming a climate risk focused unit within the BMA, I think that's going to be key, because really, I think the application of insurance and reinsurance thinking in terms of creating structures that have the ability to warehouse and analyze risk within a balance sheet. I think there's a lot of scope for partnering that type of thinking with other types of risk products in the financial markets or financial structured products. So I think there's a lot of room for innovation, and I fully expect that the Bermuda market's going to be well placed to be a hub for that.
Before I jump in, Andrew, Jeff, any perspective on that last thread that you'd like to offer?
I would certainly echo Ariane's comments about history of innovation and kind of facing challenges. So I think I couldn't agree more. And just I think the theme of data. There's so much more data and technology that we have access to now than we've ever had before, and leveraging that across the board, across the spectrum, as far as looking to defining or finding solutions, right? But leveraging the data that's now available to us. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Well, that's a nice segue to a question I would like to pose to you, as I know this group knows, and I hope the audience appreciates. Around Earth Day, the Bermuda Monetary Authority, Bermuda's consolidated financial services regulator, made a set of important announcements about climate. The announcement of their climate sandbox initiative to marry their support of innovation and market deployment of capital with innovation hub frameworks for responsible capital deployment, the formation of a climate desk, putting several of their best people and adding some people so that climate innovation in Bermuda is appropriately resourced. And I think making sure that it ties back to the traditional Bermuda reinsurance and ILS market are also supported by a team prepared to help you deploy capital in the market in a way that's responsible and bring more solutions to customers. How important is the BMA leading into climate risk in your perspective? And what would you like to see the broader island do better or differently to support your strategies, if not directly related to BMA?
I can take a personal experience with the BMA. Yeah, and again, this comes down to that these are rapidly changing risks that dynamically change over time, sometimes over a single season. Our own experience in the innovation sandbox, when we talk to our investors, all of our operating capital comes from VCs in Silicon Valley, and it's been funny because they have had, they've done tons of insurtech investments. It's been a lot about distribution in that, but all of a sudden now many of them are faced with the reality that they can't find insurance for their houses in Lake Tahoe, and now they're all hunting, going, well, yeah, I thought my new insurtech company was going to be able to cover me, but they're telling me that this random thing called reinsurers out in the middle of the Atlantic are saying that they can't cover it. And so we've had this massive connection where one of the most innovative places on earth in terms of technology, Silicon Valley, and where the capital that funds that innovation is now becoming directly linked to the most innovative market in the world in terms of like a regulatory regime that is also incredibly well respected. And that's a very critical point, because if we were a regular startup 15 years ago and we said, look, and convective storm happened then, we said, good, we're going to tackle convective storm. The idea that we would have to go state by state, become licensed in every state that has convective storm, then build up the models that are run through the state. It takes 1.5 years minimum. We're going to take the traditional approach. We'll get, we'll buy a fronting company if we're going to go fast, and now we need to capitalize it. By that time, you're already talking multiple events could have happened, and it's basically just going to go, okay, we need a state fund. We're going to throw everything there. Bermuda is pretty much one of the only places, if not the only place in the world, where the speed of change can be matched by the speed of regulatory and the necessary framework to ensure that there is stability and capital behind that. And so it plays this wildly critical role. And again, in terms of what I say of out punching its current size, in being able to protect the planet against these risks that are already here, that are getting more complex every single day. And ensuring that there is capital to create a sustainable future for a lot of these areas that have fundamentally changed.
Andrew, that qualifies as waxing poetic for me. Thank you for all of that. Jeff, would you like to supplement that in any way?
I would just add that the speed and efficacy is not does not at all compromise the rigor or integrity of the oversight that the BMA brings to the industry as a whole, which is what's so encouraging, right? It is a very robust framework that's deployed, but it's done thoughtfully and it's done efficiently. So I think that there's a testimony to the Bermuda market being where it is today. So I hand it over to Ariana.
Yeah, no, I would wholeheartedly agree and echo that. That's certainly, my experience, and as a Bermudian, I even in my first job ever, I think came into a role where I started working on these products as an undergrad. And, when I went and interviewed, it blew away the people I was interviewing with, that as, a kind of like 20-year-old, I'd worked on these things. So that's a little bit of a personal testimony, but it's definitely been the history of Bermuda for decades now. And, and I'm really excited to be a part of, helping that continue.
There are two great segues there, Jeff. I have to just observe, you're absolutely right. The default rate in the third-party Bermuda market from the dawn of time and through today is literally zero. Not approximately zero, not kind of low. It is literally zero. Every reinsurance company, insurance company licensed in Bermuda has met all their obligations. There's no AAA security that's got a better track record than that. And the BMA's Innovation Hub isn't a license to Wildcat. It's a license to get to the market with discipline in a responsible way. And but it's really neat, and there are really a lot of smart people attached to it. And I'd encourage entrepreneurs and innovators to reach out. And Aaron, your last observation there inspires me to ask, for your own teams, particularly your young employees, how do some of your client-related initiatives inspire them to contribute to your shop and to the clients you serve in the RIMS universe otherwise? What's the feedback you're getting from your younger teammates?
I would say, very positive. By and large, the junior team that I work with, they're excited about what we're doing. Some of them have been away. I myself went to New York first and then came back, but I've worked with a lot of junior talent that's come straight back. And I feel really, really good about the fact that I can say to them, these things that we're working on, this matches the type of experience, that you could have, anywhere in the world, in New York or London. And there's a genuine excitement and enthusiasm to be a part of that. And so I think it's a really special experience to be here.
I can speak for the innovative, and we've grown from small team up to 23 in a very rapid period, and we've been incredibly blessed that out of those 23 people, I think half of them have PhD. We have people who've worked at SpaceX, Google, and on the founding team of Google Earth, and come from Columbia and great schools there. And what I will tell everyone, and I'll give away our pipeline because it's something we all need to work on. There is such a massive, massive pool of talent that came out of some of the, under Pierre Gentine at Columbia, some of the best machine learning analysts for climate change that go to these large corporations, work on incredibly complex models, and then those models just go sit on a shelf, or go to the DOE, spend 4 years working on some of the most advanced models we could ever imagine, and then they just go into the side of a back-end server. And so when we've approached them and told them, here's an industry, here's something that you could build, and it's going to literally make a financial difference tomorrow when deployed. Here's the exact route that it can be done. I'm telling every person out there, you should be looking at multiple publications. You should be looking in areas. There's Kaggle, there's Hacker News. there is such a wild amount of talent out there that's so displaced and kind of upset that they're working on these problems that they're so passionate about, but nothing is ever utilized, deployed, put in production. And here we are, this industry saying, yeah, actually, this is something that we do every single day. This is day in, day out. We can absolutely use this incredible algorithm, and you'll essentially be a hero in the company if you figure out this breakthrough. So I really encourage people, no better time to find this talent than now.
Yeah, that's definitely two of my junior analysts. I think they were working on projects, or well, actually analysts, one was a PhD, so not so junior, but they were working on projects that linked directly to the research work they had done in their academic studies.
The reinsurance industry has been working in climate science for decades. I mean, arguably longer than that, but it's I don't know of another industry that's better positioned to face the challenges that we're seeing now. And I think it's incredibly exciting for folks that are interested in the space to recognize that, yeah, it's here, it's now, it's happening, right, and it's making a difference. So exciting times.
I'm not sure we can improve upon that as a closing remark, but as we hit the 5-minute mark, why don't we turn to see if you've got a short, in addition to what you've just shared with us, a short closing to send our audience off and inspired and challenged and aware of what you offer.
Ariane, you take it away.
I mean, hopefully I'm just really excited about what's next, and excited about the possibilities for collaborating. I think that's something that is also unique, or maybe it's not unique, but it's definitely special about Bermuda, is the fact that, we get to work across, companies and teams and learn from each other and contribute. And it really does feel, oftentimes that everybody's kind of part of this, team. And I think that also is part of the secret of this market's success, is that there's also a lot of great collaboration.
All right, Andrew, you pointed at Ariane. That brings you into the light of fire next.
Yeah, I think definitely echoing the same statements. It's having concrete things that we can do in terms of whether it's creating data pools and saying, all right, we all utilize this data. Let's translate it into computer readable format so we can each use it. Not just high level or creating specific, almost targeted, what I'd call bounties, where we have multiple companies saying, hey, we could all use a great way of understanding convective storm. We'll each pitch in $10,000. And, if there's someone out there, believe it, there's an ungodly amount of data scientists that sit on their computer at night trying to hunt these bounties, that it all works in similar alignment. But to that point, this really is the last safety net. There is no one else who is going to take up that mantle and control it and ensure that the world's being protected. So it's critical to accept the mistakes that happen with any innovation, and understand that this is fundamentally the only way forward.
And I would just add that it's really exciting that we're now looking at a world where there's critical mass, right? There's political will, there's investor will, there's on the ground, like genuine awareness and motivation to focus on sustainability and make the world a better place. And we're part of that solution, and I would argue a key part of that solution. So it's really exciting when things all start to line up. I mean, it's scary, right, because of what we're faced with, but it's also exciting that we're seeing that degree of alignment. So I'm inspired at the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead.
Colleagues, thank you. I think that was a perfect set of closing remarks to send us off in the right spirit. As we've heard, we have the perception that the world, the markets that we serve, traditional, old, and prospective, and the clients that you serve on an underlying basis all have significant climate risk financing needs. And the Bermuda market wants to collaborate and innovate with you. We think this is big, but we've always risen to address new needs, and we've always done it in partnership, particularly in partnership with the RIMS community. So this was a great forum with the right audience, and it was a thrill for me to moderate it. Let me thank our panelists, experts and passionate and lively. You are fantastic, and it was a privilege to moderate you. I'm sure the listeners appreciate it as well. For our listeners, thank you for joining us today. And RIMS hopes to see you again September 23rd for the next installation of our webinar series, or rather in the BDA. For additional information on that, please visit our website, www.bda.bm. And equally importantly, we're looking forward to seeing you in Bermuda, safe, clean, and close, and open for visits. Thank you, RIMS and panelists. Justin, I turn it back to you.
All right. Thank you, Stephen. I'd like to thank you and Jeff Manson, Andrew Engler, and Ariana West for your time and expertise. A copy of this webinar will be archived on rims.org within a few business days. Visit rims.org/webinars to register for upcoming sessions. Be sure to check out RIMScast. That is the Society's official free and weekly podcast, and it is hosted by yours truly. Disaster preparedness, natural catastrophes, and parametric insurance was just our topic at the start of the month. Visit rims.org/rimscast to subscribe and download. And finally, folks, RIMS is global. We'd love for you to join us. 10,000 of your peers in more than 60 countries are part of the RIMS community. This is a great time to build your network. Visit rims.org/membership to apply for a RIMS membership. Thank you all and stay safe.